Hall of Fame Village Media and the Pro Football Hall of Fame present Football Heaven.
Oh, I want to see if Joe can pull this off.
We call him One Take Corrigan.
James was on the broadcast with me for years, and he promised me. He said, if I make it to the bigs, I'm bringing you with me.
When I get to the bigs, you will come with me.
As we continue our exploration into the ever-changing media landscape in pro football, today we will be joined by two players who not only had amazing careers on the field, but they've also very successfully transitioned into the media. Hopefully they'll give us their perspectives. Hall of Famers Dan Dierdorf and James Lofton.
But first, Aditi, let's go to John Kendall and see what he has for us for this episode.
The individuals that cover the game, we have such a rich history, and so we preserve that history here in Canton, Ohio, from spotting boards, from the broadcast, the play-by-play announcers or the color commentators. This wooden piece I have over to my right is actually a spotting board that Red Grange used when he transitioned from player to commentator, and he would use pieces of cork that he would slide into each of those holes that really just basically told him the numbers of the players in each position on the football field, to this 2006 spotting board that Dick Enberg gave to Coach Dungy after their Super Bowl victory. But you can see the amount of information that Dick would put on his spotting board and could tell you, if Marvin Harrison's catching a pass, he's got all that information related to Marvin Harrison on there to communicate back to the fans. One of the things I wanted to bring Joe in to talk about a little bit is this radio headset. This was Buffalo Bills longtime commentator Van Miller. And he was, at the time, I think the longest tenured radio announcer for a single team, I think 37 seasons. And Joe, I know you've spent a lot of time in the Buffalo organization, and your father, I'm sure, knew Van pretty well.
Oh, we both knew Van really well, and he was one of the first local radio or TV personality that was presented with the Pete Rozelle Award here at the Hall of Fame. Up till then, they'd all been nationally involved in the game. But Van was just one of those guys that you show the spotter board with all the notes. I'm not sure Van ever took a note. He knew it was all in his head. He was a remarkable guy. And for our listeners that don't know Van Miller by his name, if you know the name or the phrase, it's fandemonium, that came from Van Miller, which started when the Bills were on their Super Bowl run and they were tearing down the goalpost, literally. And that's what he called it when the fans took the field. It's fandemonium, and that's been used in every NFL film's presentation of highlights for whatever reason. But that's Van Miller, and in a lot of other voices. He did a lot of voiceover with NFL films that you would recognize his voice, and you may not recognize his name, but was a great, great, great guy behind the mic.
Joe, is that a voice that an entire generation of Buffalo? What do you call people from Buffalo?
Buffalonians.
Buffalonians? Is that a voice that...
It sounds like a lunch meat, doesn't it?
Well, better than I think Pittsburghers. Or...
Well, that sounds like a lunch meat too.
But I want to call him Von, is Van Miller's voice a voice that an entire generation or two generations of Buffalonians would recognize anywhere?
Oh yeah, without a doubt, and they would recognize him too because he was very high profile in the community. Always answered the bell for any event, liked to MC events, and he was kind of Joe Namath. He walked around in a long full fur coat, which initially they made fun of, but eventually it became his trademark.
Did every team have a radio voice that carried a generation, like a Myron Cope,
sure.
like a every team, all 32?
I think there has been, obviously, if you're looking at some of the teams that maybe during some droughts they did something, changed the network contract. It really depends on your radio contract, who you get for your voice. But some have actually, jumped from one radio station to the other just to do that play-by-play call or color commentator.
Wouldn't that be funny if you had someone with a Boston accent being the voice of the Dallas Cowboys?
If you had somebody with a Boston accent in Buffalo, they would turn the radio off.
Fair point. What else do you have for us, John?
Well, Joe mentioned NFL films, and if you want to talk about who changed the NFL, media landscape, I don't know that you could think of a bigger or better media outlet than NFL films. And so these Red Sox down here are actually Ed Sable's Red Sox. He was famous for, we talked about Van Miller wearing the fur coat. He was, known for wearing that fur coat around town. Well, Ed Sable, the founder of NFL Films, he was known for wearing Red Sox with any outfit that he had. And so when he was enshrined here in the Pro Football Hall of Fame, his family donated Red Sox that he wore. And then last but not least, we have this Mike and the Mike flag here, ABC Sports. This was Leslie Visser's when she brought roamed the sidelines in 1995 as the first female to interview on the sidelines there. So, a wide spectrum of different media-related artifacts, but some tremendously important artifacts as they relate to the history of not only media, but professional football and the National Football League.
Leslie Visser is an icon, mentor, friend of mine, and she did a lot more than just interview people.
I'll say that. I saw your eyes light up when John mentioned her name, and she's a remarkable woman. She really is. But the other thing, John, talking about Ed Sable, you can now say that the Pro Football Hall of Fame has the Red Sox in it.
Wait a minute, should the guy from Buffalo be saying that? Proud about that?
No, I don't know. It sounds a little awkward. Baseball in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. Well, it's not baseball. It's when we talked about Edgerrin James' hair, it's kind of interesting that we would end up with somebody's socks. So that might be in there with the unusual artifacts of the Pro Football Hall of Fame.
If I ever get to a point to give you something, I will not give you my socks. Okay, Joe, I'm not sure that this gentleman really needs an introduction. He's obviously a Pro Football Hall of Famer. He is someone that for a long time was your radio partner. But I think if we put him on the spot, James Lofton will say traveling with me for TV broadcasts is actually more fun.
Well, I can guarantee it's more fun than being on a radio show with me.
Well, I don't know. I would tend to give both of you equal billing. So you have been highlights in my broadcasting careers.
Oh, my. I must owe him some money or something. I'm not quite sure where that came from.
I think James is only saying that because I'll be willing to share whatever bottle he wants to buy. If it's champagne, if it's
Yes,
Prosecco.
it is.
Although James doesn't drink Prosecco, I believe.
I will at times.
At times. Well, James, let's just jump right into this. When you were playing, were you actively thinking about post-career jumping to the other side? I mean, because the media was the other side, right? They were the bad guys.
Well, I don't know if they were thought of as the bad guys, because if you go back to 1978, when I came into the National Football League, there was no ESPN. I don't know if the NFL Network was even a dream of somebody that they would wake up in the middle of the night and go, oh, that'd be a great idea for us to have our own channel. And when you looked at pregame shows, they were maybe a half an hour in length. And the highlights for the league really were built around Howard Cosell's highlights. And as a player in the league, you would watch Monday Night Football to see if you were going to get a national highlight, because everything else was just local television.
Yeah, that's true, James. And, for those of you who aren't as familiar with James Lofton as we are, James' playing career transcended through 3 decades. All or a Pro Bowl performer in each of the decades. I think you're the only guy that made the Pro Bowl in 3 different decades. Isn't that correct?
I think that's a good place to start, even if it's not true.
Well, and I wonder, James, from that perspective, what were as a player, your media obligations throughout the week?
So you talk about media obligations. I can't remember if the locker room was open one day during the week for the local beat writers. Those guys I knew pretty well, Cliff Crystal and other guys who were in the Green Bay area. Vern Beaver was our photographer that we would see occasionally. So early on in my career, the only time that you really thought about the media was post game. They would come into the locker room and they would ask you questions. You put on a towel, you'd stand in front of your locker, and you'd answer questions for 5 or 10 minutes, and that was really it. One of the big highlights early in my career, Bart Starr had a TV show. So if you got invited onto the Bart Starr show, that was a big deal because there was some Western store that you got a $25 gift certificate for. So you were excited about doing that. But in terms of thinking about being in the media and how people got into the media, that was maybe one of the furthest things away from my mind the first half of my NFL career.
So then you studied engineering. What made you say, okay, when I'm finished, I'd like to actually try my hand at that media thing? And was it calling games? What was the first thought in your mind when you considered that?
Well, if you think about the engineering that I studied in the mid 70s, computers were as big as your spare bedroom, and they got smaller and smaller and smaller. And my ability to understand what was going on with computers got smaller and smaller and smaller as I got away from that field. But about the middle of my career, I had a chance in Green Bay to have a TV show. So I had the James Lofton show starting in 1983 and 1984 here in Green Bay. And so that was my first time ever really on television, interviewing players who had been on my team, thinking about content for a show during the course of the week. So that was the first time I ever thought about it, but it really wasn't something that I was thinking post-career. I didn't know if I wanted to stay in football. I hadn't really thought about it. If I wanted to be a coach, if I wanted to work in personnel. So those things were still on the table. And I was really just actively pursuing my playing career more so than thinking about my post-playing career.
You know, James, John asks a great question. He asked about your media obligations in the 70s when you first came in. How did that change, or what was the biggest change when you got to that third decade that you were a Pro Bowler, the 90s? And when you think about it now, what's the biggest change now from even then?
I would think the biggest change for me is my capacity as a player. I went from being the guy to when I went to Buffalo, I was one of the guys. So there wasn't this big media clamoring. There was a pecking order. Can we get Jim Kelly in? Can we talk to Bruce Smith? Can we talk to Thurman Thomas? Does Andre Reed want to talk to us? And somebody goes, well, James Lofton had a big game 4 weeks ago. No, we don't need him. He won't be anything. So that really changed because as I look at it now, who do we want when we're going into a production meeting? We want the head coach, either the offensive or defensive coordinator. We definitely want the quarterback. And then we want a guy who is a good guy to talk to, who's one of the prominent players. And then we want maybe a splash player, a young player who's had a good game or two, and we want to feature him in our conversation with him, or somebody who's done something newsworthy. So you're looking for all of those. And while I was in Buffalo for 4 years, I was never brought into a pre-production meeting.
Gentlemen, let me interrupt for just a second. First, I need to tell James, when I was a beat writer, the people that I most enjoyed talking to were the ones that didn't play the most. The backup quarterback was always the best source. The older veteran receiver, they had more time to explain things. So pox on that Buffalo media not recognizing.
Where were you when I needed you?
Yeah, exactly. But here, okay, so Joe, John, James is talking about production meetings, and I've been so fortunate to have gotten to do 5 or 6 of them this year in my capacity as a sideline reporter at CBS. We are sitting in a production meeting with Yale-educated Mike McDaniel, And James Lofton somehow gets him to be talking about freshman year tests that you have to take. And James pulls out a story about the blue book and calculus. I don't know what he did. So those production meetings, yes, you need to
you've got to find some common ground so that you're just not asking them football questions, because they're going to be defensive. They're going to answer the way that the head coach has taught them to answer those questions. And once you get somebody talking a little bit, their personality comes out. And that's what I want to see in meetings, because that personality is part of what drives them as a football player. Are they an introvert? Are they an extrovert? Are they a guy who wants to pull the whole team together? Or are they solely focused on their job? And so that's one of the interesting things about being in the media. But I just look at how everywhere omnipresent the media is nowadays, because it is a total cycle. It's social media, and it's the players conducting their own media. And I first witnessed that the last year I was working with Westwood One. At the end of the broadcast of the Super Bowl, we, along with the broadcast partner who is broadcasting the TV version of the Super Bowl, we have the first access to the players after the game is over. And the very last game I'm doing, it's with the Patriots. They've won the game. And so I'm running out there with my Westwood One microphone trying to interview guys. And they're going, wait a minute, I have to do this for my podcast. So they have other obligations that they've already tapped into. And so that's the change of the media. The players have now taken the media and made it part of what they do, not part of what is being done to them.
And it's not even their podcast, James. They're pulling their phones
out. Oh, yeah.
On Instagram Live before,
That's the old person in me. I'm going to podcast because that's the best I know. Yeah, the Instagram and everything else that they're doing live at that moment kind of supersedes other things that they're not getting paid for. I like the fact that the players have taken control over a lot of things that are involved with what they do. I remember Ahmad Rashad talking years ago, and Ahmad had a huge presence in the NBA. And he said the difference in the NBA and the difference in the NFL is that in the NBA, the players are kings. And in the NFL, the coaches are kings. And now that is shifting a little bit. And in terms of being kings, it used to be where the coaches made more money than the players. But how many players on an NFL roster make more money than their head coach? I would say on most teams, it's probably at least half a dozen who make more money than their head coach. So, and when it comes time to fire somebody, the head coach is normally shown the door before your great quarterback or your elite pass rusher or that number one receiver is shown the door. So they have a little more power, but they have to wield it, I think, in a certain way where they can still be part of the team as opposed to just being individuals. Because I think even when you go down that rabbit hole as a media person promoting yourself, you can't forget that you're on a team.
James was one of those guys that was setting records almost weekly in Buffalo. That's why he was so endeared to the fans there. The fans were so endeared to him. He was talking about not once did he get invited to a production meeting or that. Forget all that. He was a fan favorite. This is a guy that came in, and again, this is true. He came in and he was the missing link to a team that was on the cusp of being great. And all of a sudden we got James Lofton, stretching the defense. And, it was just, it was a great time. It's very similar to the time, the spirit of Buffalo right now in these days that occurred when James was there at the Super Bowl runs.
So to kind of further what Joe is saying, when I got to Buffalo, I'm there the first year, the second year, I end up playing 4 years there. And in the third year, I start to get a little exposure doing radio. So I'm doing a little weekly radio hit with one of the local stations in trade for some rental furniture that they're giving me for the apartment that we're living in. And then the next year, I have a television show. And the year prior to that, I had gone with my agent to New York to kind of talk about and to explore broadcasting after I finished playing. So I go into a meeting with one of the networks and they say, well, what have you done? And I said, well, I had the James Lofton show back in 1983 and 84, and now it's 1991. And they said, well, that's a long time ago. We need to see something a little more current that you've done. So, okay, so I kind of filed that away. go back to Buffalo, and the next year I have the James Lofton show. And it's kind of like the David Letterman show because I start backstage, I walk down a aisle hallway, and then I come out and I do a 90-second monologue. Van Miller, who is the voice of the Buffalo Bills and the number one sports broadcaster in Buffalo, is my Ed McMahon. He's sitting on a couch with me. So I have these shows, and we go to the Super Bowl. So I have 21 half-hour shows. I do an hour-long Christmas special on the set of It's a Wonderful Life, which was a theater show that was playing in downtown Buffalo. So after the season's over, I'm really excited because I'm going to contact this broadcasting network to tell them that I have these 21 shows, that I have an hour Super Bowl special on a Christmas set. And they say, do you want me to send you these shows? They say, well, we really don't need to see the work. We just need to know you've done it. So I thought that was great because what it tells you is that they want to know that you're comfortable in front of the camera or that you can be yourself. They really don't want to examine your work because they're looking for high profile names. And after that season was over, I finished playing and I do get a job at CNN. And we have a show called NFL Preview. And like I said, at the time in the early 90s, that was a half-hour show that came on an hour before the kickoff of the NFL season. We were on at noon, the Eastern. Game started at 1. And everybody else had an hour show. All the big networks had just an hour, if you can imagine that, to talk about what was going to transpire that weekend.
James, of all the guys that you've gotten to meet with over the last few years in production meetings, is there someone that jumps at you that you could see making that same transition? Is there someone you'd like to see?
There are guys all the time. And it's funny because you think to yourself, do I have the radio FM voice? And 99% of the guys who are coming out of football don't have that voice. The guy who has a deep, kind of almost scratchy, but has great personality and is one of the biggest humans I've ever seen, Calais Campbell. And I'm watching him and I'm going, you know what? Because what I realized in this game, I love the fact that the analysts who are in the game are from multiple positions and you have a different set of eyes. You're seeing the game a little differently than somebody else sees it. So I think that's important. And I think Calais Campbell jumps out at me because of his size, his personality, and just the fact that he's somebody who treats people really well. You notice that about him. And I think that's important in this business. And he also doesn't think too much of himself because if you're full of yourself and you go on the air, I think that's a big turnoff to people.
For sure. Do you get asked about it a lot? You know, we see at practice guys asking you about when you played and routes and things like that. Do people ask you about the TV side?
Now they're asking me, did you play?
So they're asking you about your brilliant sideline reporter, right? They're saying, hey, who's that smart one?
You get that a little bit, but I think the guys that I'm talking to, it's that transition. How do you get over that transition? Because I think that if you're a guy who's going to play 2 or 3 years, you spend about 2 or 3 more years trying to get back into the league. Whether you're on somebody's roster during the offseason, you cut at the end of training camp, you still think that you can physically play. When I was a rookie, we had a tight end in Green Bay by the name of Rich McGeorge. And traditionally, they would take the rookies to this little bar in De Pere, Wisconsin called Nicky's. And while we're at that little bar, we've been in training camp for about 2 weeks. Rich McGeorge looks at me and says, every player becomes an ex-player. I haven't even played a preseason game. And all of a sudden, he's planted that seed in my mind. And that was 45 years ago that he said that to me. Every player becomes an ex-player. And I think for most of the players, it's that unknown. What do you pursue? Where do you live? Because you grew up, you went to high school in one place. You go to college in another. If you have a 10-year career in the NFL, you probably play in 3 different locations. So where is home? Is it where your spouse is from? Is it where you went to college? Is it where you grew up? I think that's one of the tough things for NFL players to kind of adjust to.
We are being joined by a football media legend, as well as a Pro Football Hall of Famer. And there aren't many in the Pro Football Hall of Fame that carry the same credentials as Dan Dierdorf does into his post-playing career as a member of the media. Dan, welcome to our podcast.
It is my pleasure to be here, and I hope everybody's well.
Everybody here is well. And, Dan, I don't want to, recap your entire career in an introduction.
Oh, go ahead.
So, we'd have to make 3 shows, 3 episodes.
I'm tired of hearing it.
Well, it's a good question to ask Dan. Do you wish that PFF was around when you were playing?
Do I wish what was around?
Pro Football Focus, such that we knew how many pancakes you had and how many sacks you allowed, which I'm sure was 0. And
I'm sure that if I would have been happy with the result, I would have said, wow, this is a great organization. If I was unhappy, my response would have been, what do you expect from a bunch of minions sitting around who don't know anything about football, and they're just looking for a better job, and this is what they're doing in the interim. I would be somewhere in between.
You define something there though too, Dan. When that's how players like yourself would have thought in the 60s and 70s and 80s about the non-experienced media. You're saying, well, what does he know about offensive line play other than who got called for holding?
Right.
And so as Aditi asked,
well,
with us here,
let me just throw this at you. All right, we're talking about PFF. Okay. If that's Anthony Munoz sitting there grading my performance, well, then that's one thing. But
that's right.
It's not.
Okay, well, Dan, do you remember feeling that way as a player? Do you remember questioning the credentials of the people that were writing about you or talking about you on the radio or asking you questions in a locker room?
Well, first of all, you have to understand something. When I was a player, which was basically the decade of the 70s, we didn't have the proliferation of media that we have now. There was no ESPN. There was no 24 hours a day breakdown of every piece of minutia and when they run out of minutia, then they really move off into the stratosphere.
I know that you did some NFL games for CBS prior to Monday Night Football, but if we think about your start at Monday Night Football in 1987 with Al Michaels, who's still, of course, going,
Right.
and we go to when you finally said, okay, traveling every single week is enough, 2013 with, I believe, Greg Gumbel. Was there a difference in the way you called games? From 1987 to 2013, did viewers want something different from you?
I've never really looked at how different it was. It's always different when you're in a 3-man booth. So the 3-man booth is both a blessing and a curse. It's a curse in a really highly competitive football game, because as an analyst, when you're in a 3-man booth, I only have half the job. Frank Gifford and I shared a job. Al was the only play-by-play announcer, but Frank and I shared a job, which meant that I didn't talk after every play. We kind of took turns, and so.
Would you elbow him though? If you really had something to say, would you tell him, "Hey, pipe down here"?
We had body language where if one of us, we knew. I mean, we didn't physically smack each other around, but But the point is that I viewed it was kind of like guerrilla warfare. You were behind a tree, you jumped out, you took your shot, and you jumped back behind the tree because you couldn't get a flow going, because after the next play, it was his turn to talk, and no matter what I wanted to say, it wasn't relevant anymore. So there was a certain way to broadcast in a 3-man booth on Monday Night Football, and that's the way it was. Then when I went back to CBS, John Madden in many ways had changed the way all of us broadcast football, and it became more technical. It became, because the viewing audience was more educated and into the nuances of the game. They understood more about blocking schemes and coverages and whatever. So yeah, I think we if there was a change as the years went by, we all got a little more technically oriented in our deliveries.
Dan, as you look back, are there other things that you think really changed in the way you analyze the game and the way you broadcast the game, and through all those decades of doing it?
Not really. In other words, the technological advances, the sky cams, and it sounds goofy to say that I predated that, but I did. But it was hey, I remember on Monday night we had a big philosophical argument about whether to put the score bug on the screen. It used to be that we had nothing on the screen except football.
That's right.
And there was competing schools of thought. Why should we put a continuous score bug up there? Because why would you want to advertise that the score of the game is 35-7? Because that means that's just an invitation to tune out. Yep. And ultimately, that's where we went. And I'm just saying, all of these things happened on my watch while I was doing games. And it got to the point at the end where at least I never worked at ESPN where we had crawlers continually going on underneath. At least at CBS, we were just doing football.
Well, that does beg the question, though, as you talk about more cameras. I've had the conversation, Dan, with officials who've said their job has gotten harder the more and more high definition 4K, 8K cameras there are, because it used to just be their eyes and their eyes alone.
Right.
And now everybody at home is seeing 500 views in high def of what they had a split second to see. So from your angle, better or worse?
I came at it from another direction with the officials. I really tried to take the time to explain how often they are right. And I think more often than not, all these high definition angles that you're talking about, they prove what a pretty good job these guys are doing.
That's right.
I mean, some of the calls they make, yes, they're corroborated by a super slow-mo, but they didn't see it in super slow-mo. And right. A lot of times you got to give them, I tried to give them credit for making a damn good call when they did.
But did you like having more cameras available to you? Or was it simpler to call the game when there wasn't a pylon cam and a slow-mo and a this and a that?
Well, some camera angles are conducive to being an analyst because they really show you, something that you could educate the viewer with. If you're a close-up of a guy's face for 50 yards as he's running, that can be compelling television. I mean, that can really, but from an analyst perspective, what are you supposed to do? I mean,
he's got pretty eyes.
You can't tell it straight over it. You can't. That's right. Wow. Doesn't he have a great complexion? I mean, you would. So it depends. Yeah. Sometimes having 30 cameras covering a football game is not the analyst's best friend that you might think it is.
In the interest of full transparency, you are a Canton native and grew up here. So you have memories of the Hall of Fame, the Pro Football Hall of Fame, starting with the breaking, the groundbreaking in 1963. Yes. Tell us a little bit about how you remember the Pro Football Hall of Fame in Canton.
Joe, I think that groundbreaking was in 1962.
It actually was. Yes, it was. The grand opening was 63.
That's exactly right. You're exactly right. You know, I know some people have heard it before, but you know, I was 13 years old in 1962, and I was standing there with my father, and we watched the groundbreaking. And Joe, you know, I wasn't the only Hall of Famer there, was I?
No, you weren't. Alan Page was there. Alan Page actually worked with the construction crew that helped build the building.
And
also,
I believe Larry Zonka was there.
That's correct. That's correct. He came down from Stowe.
Yeah. And so I only lived a mile from the hall. And I used to ride my bike down there while it was being constructed. You know, the rotunda, the football, you know, when that was being built, I'd never seen a roof line quite like that. And it took me a while to try to figure out what the heck that was.
We still haven't.
I used to walk through it while it was under construction. I went to every enshrinement, every Hall of Fame game until I started playing in the NFL. And so, yes, I probably have a different place in my heart for the Hall of Fame than most everyone else who's been enshrined there. It was growing up in Canton, Ohio, you realize that the Hall of Fame is just woven into the DNA of every Canton resident for the last 75 years.
James, you've been to Canton a lot of times.
Sure.
Yeah, and obviously we tell all of our Hall of Famers this is your second home. Do you have any story about visiting Canton or being in Canton you'd like to share?
Well, I think one of the great things for me is I grew up in a single parent family, and my dad was the single parent. And I was the youngest of 4 kids, so all the other kids are out of the house. And I'm about 9 or 10 years old, and we're sitting there watching a game on our big black and white television. And my dad says, we're watching the Browns, and he says, they're talking about Jim Brown. And he goes, well, you know, he's no Marion Motley. Now, a 9-year-old has never heard of Marion Motley. Didn't know Marion Motley's name from anybody. But when I finally went to Canton, I got to see who Marion Motley was. Number 76 for the Cleveland Browns. A great running back. And somebody that Joe knows that when we did our radio program, and I asked Jim Brown about him, Jim Brown reverted to like a 15-year-old kid, talking about how he adored Marion Motley and how much it meant for him to go to the Cleveland Browns because of players like Marion Motley. So when you go to Canton, you have that history, and it just seeps into you. And so I was standing there in front of Marion Motley's bust and looking at his uniform going, this is what my dad was talking about. And it was just so special for me.
Visit Canton and experience Hall of Famers' hometown favorites for yourself. Plan your trip to America's playing field. If you enjoyed today's episode, please check out the Hall's other exciting podcast, The Mission. Introducing the HOFV Pass 2023, your ticket to the Hall of Fame Village, a world-class sports and entertainment destination situated around the Pro Football Hall of Fame Museum in Canton, Ohio. The Hall of Fame Village Pass is a limited run of digital collectibles. Owners receive exclusive access to events, promotions, discounts, specials, and more. Get your HOFV Pass at HOFVpass.com.
For more Football Heaven episodes and bonus content, please visit Hall of Fame Village Media and Pro Football Hall of Fame social media.